At a luxury Boston gala, a room full of wealthy strangers laughed at a woman in a red dress and the quiet single father sitting beside her. They thought she was cold. They thought he was nobody. But minutes later, the entire room fell silent when the truth about the powerful CEO's past came out. And the only man who stayed beside her was the man they mocked first. What started as humiliation became a story about loneliness, pride, and two broken people learning how to breathe again. Before we begin, share where you're watching from. And if this story stirs something in you, subscribe for more stories of honor, sacrifice. Your support truly means the world. Cold wind rolled in from Boston Harbor, carrying salt, melted snow, and the kind of silence expensive buildings tried hard to hide. The Ashford Grand Hotel stood near the waterfront, like an aging aristocrat refusing to admit its glory days were gone. Its marble floor still shined beneath crystal chandeliers, and the brass railings still reflected warm gold under the ballroom lights. But the building carried the faint exhaustion of something preserved too carefully for too long. Wealthy people liked places like that. Old money trusted old walls. Inside the main ballroom, servers moved quietly between tables, dressed in white linen, while a jazz trio played near the back windows overlooking the harbor. Men in tailored tuxedos laughed louder than necessary. Women with expensive jewelry touched each other's arms while pretending not to judge one another. Victoria Hale entered without announcement. Conversations did not stop completely when she walked in, but they bent around her. At 34, Victoria had become one of the youngest CEOs in the luxury hospitality industry after rebuilding Hale & Mercer from near bankruptcy into a hotel empire spread across the East Coast. People in Boston business circles described her the same way they described winter storms or high-end litigation: beautiful, cold, and expensive to survive. She wore a dark red satin gown with long sleeves and a narrow cut that followed her tall frame without trying too hard to attract attention. The dress made her impossible not to notice anyway. Her black hair, thick and naturally wavy, rested against one bare shoulder. Her face was striking rather than soft. Sharp cheekbones, tired gray eyes, a mouth that rarely looked fully relaxed. She walked with perfect posture, though not because she was confident. It came from years of teaching herself never to look vulnerable in rooms full of men who collected weakness like trophies. A waiter approached with champagne. "Miss Hale?" Victoria gave a polite shake of her head. "No alcohol tonight." The waiter nodded quickly and stepped away. At the far side of the ballroom, Daniel Mercer watched her over the rim of his whiskey glass. Daniel was the kind of man who had been handsome for too long and knew it had become part of his authority. 46 years old, silver beginning to creep into his dark beard, broad shoulders softened slightly by age and expensive dinners. He sat on the board of Hale & Mercer and carried himself with the easy arrogance of someone born into rooms like this. "She came alone again," one man beside him muttered. Daniel smirked faintly. "Victoria always comes alone." The men around him chuckled quietly. Nobody said the rest out loud, but everyone knew the rumors. Victoria dated nobody for long. Engagements ended, relationships disappeared quietly. One former investor had once called her emotionally unreachable during a dinner party after too much wine. The phrase had followed her for 3 years. Victoria heard enough whispers to recognize the tone without hearing the words. She ignored them and continued walking. Near the entrance, Ethan Brooks stood beside a marble column, wishing he had never accepted the invitation. At 39, Ethan looked older in certain lights and younger in others. He was tall, lean from physical work rather than exercise, with rough hands marked by old cuts and faded burns from years repairing electrical systems and heating units. His dark brown hair carried streaks of gray near the temples, and he kept a short beard, mostly because shaving every morning felt unnecessary after his divorce. There was something steady about his face. Not conventionally handsome, but dependable. The kind of face people trusted when something broke at 2 a.m. He adjusted the cuffs of his old charcoal suit and looked painfully aware that it had been tailored for him nearly 10 years earlier. "Relax," said Martin Keller beside him. Martin owned the small maintenance company Ethan worked for. Short, round-shouldered, permanently sweating under pressure. He had the nervous friendliness of a man who apologized before entering elevators. "You look fine," Martin whispered. "I look like a guy who fixes boilers." Martin shrugged. "That's because you are." Ethan almost smiled. Across the ballroom, he noticed Victoria Hale for the first time. He recognized her immediately, from magazines and business articles, though she looked different in person, less polished somehow, more tired around the eyes. Not weak, just tired. Before he could look away, a voice cut through the room behind him. "Well, this should be interesting." 3 men approached from the bar area carrying drinks. The loudest was Gregory Shaw, a real estate broker known mostly for inheriting his father's clients. Gregory was broad and red-faced, with slick blonde hair combed too carefully backward. He wore confidence the way insecure men often did, aggressively. Beside him walked Tyler Dean, younger, thin, sharp-nosed, constantly smiling at jokes before they finished. The third man, Richard Vale, stayed quieter than the others, though his silence carried the unpleasant feeling of someone who enjoyed cruelty privately. Gregory looked Ethan up and down. "Brooks, right? Maintenance guy?" Ethan nodded once. "That's me." Gregory lifted his bourbon glass slightly toward Victoria across the ballroom. "You know who that is?" "I know." Gregory grinned. "Perfect." Ethan already disliked where the conversation was going. Tyler leaned closer. "You two should sit together. Seriously, think about it." Gregory laughed. "Boston's Ice Queen and the Divorced Repairman. That's a movie nobody watches twice." Richard snorted quietly into his drink. Ethan felt heat crawl slowly into his chest, though his face remained calm. "Funny," he said flatly. "Oh, come on," Gregory continued. "She scares every billionaire in the city away, and you look like you apologize to furniture after bumping into it. You're basically made for each other." The men laughed, not loudly. That made it worse. Ethan glanced toward Victoria again. She had clearly heard enough to understand the situation. Her expression did not change, but he noticed something in her posture shift. Not embarrassment exactly, more like exhaustion. Like this was simply another version of a conversation she had survived too many times already. That bothered him more than the joke itself. Without another word, Ethan walked across the ballroom. Behind him, Gregory called out dramatically, "There he goes! Boston romance is alive after all!" A few nearby guests turned to watch. Victoria remained standing beside an empty chair near the harbor windows when Ethan reached her table. Up close, she seemed even more guarded. The kind of woman who expected disappointment early, so it hurt less when it arrived. Ethan pulled the chair back for her quietly. "You don't have to stand there and let them do that," he said. Victoria studied him carefully. Most men looked directly at her beauty first. Ethan looked tired instead. Not intimidated, not impressed. Just tired of unnecessary cruelty. "And what exactly are they doing?" she asked softly. Ethan glanced toward the men laughing near the bar. "Trying to feel taller." For the first time that evening, something almost human crossed Victoria's face. Not a smile yet, but close. The jazz music softened as the dinner service began, and the ballroom settled into the polished rhythm wealthy people mistook for elegance. Silverware clicked against porcelain. Waiters moved like shadows between tables. Outside the harbor windows, snow drifted slowly across the black water beyond the docks. Victoria Hale sat across from Ethan Brooks, with one hand resting lightly against the stem of her untouched water glass. Up close, Ethan noticed details the magazines never captured about her. There were faint shadows beneath her gray eyes, hidden carefully beneath makeup. A thin scar near her left wrist disappeared beneath the sleeve of her red dress whenever she moved her hand. Her posture remained perfect, but not naturally. It looked practiced, like something learned through repetition rather than confidence. Victoria noticed Ethan studying the room instead of studying her. Most men stared at her directly. Ethan seemed more interested in surviving the evening quietly. "You look uncomfortable," she said. Ethan glanced down at his old suit jacket. "That obvious?" "A little. That's unfortunate." Something near the corner of Victoria's mouth moved slightly before disappearing again. A waiter approached carrying 2 plates of salmon and set them down carefully. The young waiter's name tag read Cameron. He looked barely 22, slim, pale, with nervous brown curls constantly falling over his forehead. He thanked Victoria 3 separate times for no reason before walking away too quickly. Ethan noticed the kid's hands shaking slightly. "First month working events like this," Ethan murmured. Victoria looked surprised. "You can tell?" "He keeps checking whether people are disappointed before they even speak." Victoria stared at him for a second longer than expected. That was the problem already, she realized. Ethan paid attention to people in a way most powerful men didn't anymore. Not strategically, naturally. Across the ballroom, Gregory, Shaw, and his group had mostly lost interest now that their joke had failed to create a scene. They laughed loudly near the bar anyway, compensating for the room slowly drifting away from them. Victoria could feel Gregory glancing toward her table every few minutes, waiting for signs of discomfort. Instead, she found herself asking Ethan questions she normally avoided asking strangers. "How long have you worked maintenance?" "Since I was 19. "You ever want something else?" Ethan cut into his salmon slowly before answering. "I used to think I did." Victoria waited. "My father owned a garage outside Providence," he continued. "Small place, nothing impressive, but he could fix almost anything. Furnace systems, engines, electrical panels. People trusted him." Ethan paused briefly. "Then he got sick." His voice remained calm, but Victoria noticed the subtle tightening in his jaw. "Cancer?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded once. "Pancreatic." Victoria looked down at her plate. Fast. Cruel. She knew that kind. "He kept working almost until the end," Ethan said. "Wouldn't let anybody help him. I think he thought stopping would make it real." "And you took over?" "For a while." "What happened?" Ethan gave a faint shrug. "Medical bills happened." There was no self-pity in the way he said it. That unsettled Victoria more than anger would have. He simply sounded like a man describing weather he survived years ago. Victoria folded her hands together carefully. "My father lost everything before he died." Ethan looked up then, not curious, just listening. "Hale and Mercer was small when I was growing up," Victoria said. "One hotel, maybe 2 properties at most." She stared toward the harbor windows while speaking, as if the glass made it easier. "Then an expansion deal failed. Investors pulled out. My father borrowed money trying to save the company. And Boston enjoys watching people fall apart if they used to be important." Ethan said nothing. That made it easier for her to continue. "People stopped speaking to us almost overnight. My mother pretended she didn't notice. My father pretended he could fix it." She exhaled slowly. "Then one morning, he collapsed in his office." Ethan noticed her fingers tightening around the water glass now. "He died before the ambulance arrived," she said. The sentence landed between them quietly. No dramatic pause, no performance. Just truth. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair. "How old were you?" 24. "That's young to carry something like that." Victoria almost laughed at the understatement. "I spent the next 10 years making sure nobody ever saw me weak again." "And did it work?" The question caught her off guard. Not because it was rude, because nobody usually asked what happened after survival. Victoria looked directly at him for the first time that evening. Ethan's face carried the rough wear of real life. Exhaustion near the eyes, old stress settled permanently into the lines around his mouth. But there was patience in him too, the kind built slowly through disappointment instead of success. "No," she admitted softly. "It just made people afraid to get close." Ethan nodded once like he understood exactly what she meant, which somehow made her chest ache unexpectedly. A woman approached their table before the silence could deepen further. "Victoria?" The voice belonged to Eleanor Whitmore, one of the senior investors attached to Hale and Mercer. Eleanor was nearly 60, tall and elegant with silver blonde hair cut sharply at the jawline. Years earlier, she had survived a public financial scandal after her husband was imprisoned for fraud committed without her knowledge. Since then, she had rebuilt herself into someone emotionally difficult to surprise. Eleanor looked briefly at Ethan. "And who is this?" "Ethan Brooks," Victoria answered before Ethan could speak. "He works with Keller Maintenance." Eleanor extended a hand politely. "Anyone willing to repair old Boston buildings deserves hazard pay." Ethan shook her hand lightly. "That's accurate." Eleanor studied him with quiet intelligence. Victoria recognized the look immediately. Eleanor was trying to determine whether Ethan wanted something. After a moment, Eleanor leaned closer toward Victoria. "You have board members asking where you disappeared to." "I'm aware." "And are you planning to rescue them from each other?" "Not immediately." For the first time all evening, Eleanor looked faintly amused. "Well," she said, straightening slightly, "that alone makes him interesting." After she walked away, Ethan glanced toward Victoria. "Your world seems exhausting." Victoria let out a soft breath through her nose. "You have no idea." "I think I do." Their eyes held for a moment longer than either intended. Not romance. Recognition. Two people realizing the other carried loneliness differently, but carried it all the same. Hours passed without Victoria noticing. The ballroom slowly emptied as older donors left for private after-parties, and younger executives drifted toward hotel bars, where conversations became louder and less honest. At some point, Ethan removed his jacket because the room had grown warm. Victoria noticed the rolled sleeves of his white shirt, the faded scar running along one forearm near his wrist. Old electrical burn. "You almost got electrocuted once," she observed. Ethan looked down at the scar. "Twice, technically." Victoria stared at him. "You say that like it's normal." "In maintenance work? It kind of is." She shook her head quietly, and for the first time that night, she laughed. Not the polished, social laugh she used during interviews. A real one. Short. Unprepared. Ethan froze for half a second because the sound changed her completely. The woman everyone in Boston called cold suddenly looked painfully human. And Victoria realized with growing discomfort that nearly 2 hours had passed beside Ethan Brooks, without her pretending to be anyone at all. By Monday morning, Boston had already turned the gala into gossip. In private clubs near Beacon Hill, men discussed Victoria Hale over cigars and whiskey, as if she were a business trend instead of a person. Financial blogs posted blurry photographs of her sitting beside Ethan Brooks near the harbor windows. One headline described him as the mystery working-class companion beside Hale and Mercer's elusive CEO. Another called him an unlikely attachment. Victoria saw all of it before 8 in the morning. She sat alone in her office on the 32nd floor of Hale and Mercer Tower. The skyline spread behind her beneath a gray winter sky. Her office looked expensive in the restrained way old wealth preferred. Dark walnut shelves, soft lighting, no unnecessary decoration. Nothing personal except a framed photograph turned slightly away on the corner of her desk. The picture showed Victoria at 23, beside her father outside their first hotel property. She still kept it faced partially inward, because some days she could not bear looking directly at his smile. Her assistant knocked softly before entering. Claire Bennett carried a tablet against her chest. 31 years old, sharp-featured, blonde hair tied into a severe knot that made her look stricter than she actually was. Claire had worked beside Victoria for nearly 7 years and had developed the quiet emotional reflexes of someone who survived corporate warfare daily. She spoke gently to staff, ruthlessly to lawyers, and never twice to incompetent men. "You have 3 interviews today," Claire said carefully, "and Daniel Mercer requested an emergency board discussion." Victoria did not look up from the article on her screen. "About Ethan Brooks?" Claire hesitated half a second. "Yes." Victoria leaned back slowly in her chair. That answered enough already. Meanwhile, across the city in South Boston, Ethan Brooks was kneeling beside a leaking heating system inside an old apartment building when Martin Keller called him downstairs. The basement smelled faintly of rust and detergent. pipes rattled overhead every few minutes. Martin stood near the service entrance looking unusually nervous, shifting his weight between feet. Beside him waited a man Ethan immediately recognized from the gala, Daniel Mercer. Up close, Daniel looked even more polished than before. Tall, broad through the shoulders despite his age. Dark-tailored overcoat fitted perfectly against his frame. His silver-threaded beard was trimmed with surgical precision. Men like Daniel spent decades learning how to make control appear effortless. Ethan wiped his hands on a rag before approaching. "Mr. Mercer?" Daniel offered a polite smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Brooks, appreciate you taking a moment." Martin cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'll, check the trucks." The second Martin disappeared upstairs, silence settled heavily between the two men. Daniel glanced around the basement. Exposed pipes, concrete floors, old fluorescent lighting buzzing faintly overhead. "You've worked hard," Daniel said. Ethan already disliked the tone. "What can I do for you?" Daniel folded his gloves carefully into one hand. "I'll be direct. I respect direct men." Ethan said nothing. Daniel continued. "Victoria Hale exists under constant scrutiny. Investors monitor everything around her, every friendship, every appearance, every personal decision." He paused briefly. "You understand that, I assume?" "I understand people like talking." "This is larger than gossip." Daniel stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice. "You seem like a decent man, Mr. Brooks, which is why I'd rather handle this privately." There it was. Ethan felt the conversation harden beneath the surface. Daniel removed a folded document from inside his coat pocket. "There's a facilities management position opening in Connecticut under one of our secondary properties. Better salary, housing included." His expression remained calm. "You'd never need to struggle financially again." Ethan stared at the paper without touching it. "And what exactly do I have to do for that?" Daniel's answer came smoothly. "Nothing dramatic. Simply create distance between yourself and Victoria." The basement grew very quiet. Somewhere upstairs, footsteps echoed briefly through old pipes. Ethan looked at Daniel for several seconds before speaking. "You think I'm after her money?" "No," Daniel answered honestly. "I think the world will assume you are." "That your concern?" "My concern," Daniel said carefully, "is protecting a company employing thousands of people. Victoria has spent 10 years building authority in rooms already uncomfortable with powerful women. Public attachment to someone outside that world complicates things." Ethan gave a short, humorless laugh. "Outside that world." Daniel did not react. Ethan finally took the document from his hand, glanced once at the salary printed across the page, then folded it in half again. "My father spent his whole life being looked down on by people with money," Ethan said quietly. "You know what bothered him most?" Daniel remained silent. "It wasn't the disrespect." Ethan handed the paper back. "It was how polite rich people sounded while doing it." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly for the first time. "This isn't personal." "That's usually when it is." Before Daniel could answer, footsteps approached from the stairwell. Victoria. Neither man had heard her arrive. She stood near the bottom step, wearing a charcoal wool coat over a black turtleneck dress, dark hair slightly damp from melted snow outside. Her expression remained controlled, but Ethan noticed the exhaustion underneath immediately. Claire stood several feet behind her, holding a folder tightly against her chest, clearly uncomfortable being there. Victoria's eyes moved once between the two men. "What's going on?" Daniel answered first. "A private business matter." Ethan saw something close inside her face at those words. Not anger. Withdrawal. The old reflex returning. Victoria looked directly at Ethan now. "Did he offer you something?" Daniel turned sharply toward her. "Victoria, did he?" Ethan could have explained everything right there. Could have told her the truth plainly. Instead, he saw the tension already building in her shoulders. The humiliation of finding her private life reduced to negotiation again. And suddenly, he felt tired. Tired of rooms deciding what people like him were worth. Tired of watching her survive men like Daniel every day. Ethan looked away first. "It doesn't matter." Victoria absorbed the sentence in silence. That hurt more than anger would have. Because to her, it sounded like surrender. She nodded once slowly, all expression disappearing behind the familiar executive mask Boston knew too well. "I understand," she said. But Ethan realized immediately she didn't. Victoria turned toward the stairs again. Claire hesitated before following her, glancing back once toward Ethan with visible sympathy. Daniel exhaled quietly after they left. "You should have explained." Ethan stared toward the empty stairwell. "No," he said softly. "I shouldn't have had to." That evening, Victoria canceled 2 personal calls, ignored Ethan's single text message asking if she got home safely, and buried herself inside 12 straight hours of contracts, investor meetings, and budget reviews. By midnight, Hale and Mercer Tower had gone almost entirely dark, except for the light still burning inside her office. Victoria sat alone behind her desk, wearing the same black dress, one hand pressed against her forehead. The silence in the room felt familiar again. Safe, cold, and somewhere across the city, Ethan Brooks stood alone outside his apartment building, beneath falling snow, looking down at his unanswered phone before finally sliding it back into his pocket. Neither of them slept much that night. Snow had stopped falling over Boston by the night of the Hale and Mercer winter announcement, but the city still looked frozen beneath the glass towers and harbor lights. The Grand Lexington Convention Hall glowed above downtown like a jewel box built for rich people to admire themselves inside. Television crews crowded near the stage. Investors in dark tailored suits moved between champagne tables, speaking in careful financial language. Assistants with headsets rushed through backstage corridors, pretending urgency meant importance. Victoria Hale stood alone behind the curtain, waiting to walk on stage. The red dress was different tonight. Not softer. Worse. The fabric was darker than the one she wore at the gala. Deep crimson velvet fitted tightly against her tall frame, with long sleeves and an open back. The dress made her look powerful from a distance. Up close, it only made her look tired in expensive lighting. Claire Bennett adjusted the tablet in her hands while watching Victoria carefully. "You don't have to do the full speech," Claire said quietly. "The board mostly wants the project announcement." Victoria stared toward the bright stage lights bleeding through the curtain seam. "I know what they want." Claire hesitated, then softer. "You haven't slept." Victoria almost smiled at that. "You sound like Ethan." The name changed the air briefly between them. Claire lowered her eyes. She knew enough not to ask questions. Victoria looked down at her own hands. Perfect manicure. Diamond ring on her right hand she wore only for public appearances, because it discouraged conversations she no longer had energy for. She suddenly felt absurdly exhausted by all of it. 3 weeks had passed since the conversation in the basement. 3 weeks of silence. Ethan never contacted her again after the unanswered text. Victoria never reached out either. She buried herself inside work with almost violent discipline. 14-hour days, investor meetings, site reviews, interviews. The old survival routine returned easily because she had practiced it most of her adult life. But something had changed since meeting him. The silence felt heavier now, not peaceful, empty. A stage coordinator approached nervously. His name was Neil Porter, a thin man in his 40s with narrow shoulders and permanent stress lines around his mouth. Years organizing political events had trained him to fear unpredictable human emotion more than technical disasters. "Miss Hale," he said carefully, "we're ready for you." Victoria nodded once, then she walked onto the stage. The applause arrived instantly. Polite, controlled, thousands of tiny social calculations disguised as admiration. Victoria stood behind the podium, beneath warm white lights, while giant screens displayed the Hale and Mercer logo behind her. Cameras flashed constantly from the press section. For the first several minutes, she performed perfectly. Revenue growth, expansion plans, historic redevelopment projects along the harbor. Her voice remained smooth and calm, every sentence measured precisely. The audience relaxed. Investors smiled again. This was the Victoria Hale they understood. Elegant, composed, emotionally untouchable. Then she looked toward the front row. Daniel Mercer sat there with his hands folded neatly in his lap, watching her with the same controlled expression he used during negotiations. Beside him sat two investors from New York, whispering occasionally while checking notes. And suddenly, Victoria realized she was tired of speaking like a machine built to reassure powerful men. Her next sentence stopped halfway. Silence spread slowly across the room. Somewhere backstage, Claire straightened immediately. Victoria looked down briefly at the podium before speaking again, but this time her voice sounded different, lower, less rehearsed. "My mother died 11 years ago," she said. The room froze. Daniel's head lifted sharply. No investor presentation in Hale and Mercer history had ever started like this. Victoria continued before fear could stop her. She spent most of her life pretending she was fine. Her fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the podium, especially near the end. The cameras kept flashing, but more slowly now. "She suffered from depression for years," Victoria said. "Back when wealthy families preferred calling it exhaustion or sensitivity because those words sounded cleaner." Nobody moved. Nobody even coughed. Victoria stared somewhere beyond the audience now, no longer fully seeing them. "The last time I saw my mother alive, she was wearing a red dress." She swallowed once. "I remember thinking she looked beautiful, strong." A faint breath escaped her. "I didn't realize strength and loneliness could look identical from far away." Near the back of the hall, several reporters slowly lowered their phones. Victoria had spent 10 years controlling every public narrative surrounding her life. Watching her abandon that control felt almost intimate. "I started wearing red after she died," she admitted quietly. "At every important event, every negotiation, every opening." Her expression tightened briefly. "I think part of me believed if I looked strong enough, nobody would notice how afraid I was becoming." The silence inside the convention hall deepened. Not uncomfortable, human. Victoria looked down at the audience again, and for the first time in years, she stopped speaking like a CEO. "There are moments," she said softly, "when powerful people convince themselves that vulnerability is the same thing as weakness." Her gray eyes moved slowly across the crowd. "And if you live that way long enough, eventually you've stopped knowing how to let anyone stay close to you." Near the rear entrance, Ethan Brooks stood motionless beside the doors. He still wore work clothes beneath a dark winter coat because he had come directly from a maintenance call across the harbor. Snow melted slowly on his boots. His rough hands remained reddened from cold weather and metal tools. He had not planned to attend, but Claire had called him 2 hours earlier. "She's not doing well," she had said quietly over the phone. That was all. Now Ethan watched Victoria standing alone beneath stage lights while hundreds of powerful people sat in silence around her. And for the first time since the gala, she looked less like a CEO than a woman exhausted from carrying herself alone for too many years. Victoria finished the speech without another polished line. No corporate joke, no triumphant ending, just honesty. When the applause finally came, it sounded uneven at first because people were unsure whether applause even belonged after something real. Backstage afterward, the hallway buzzed with nervous energy. Publicists whispered frantically. Investors spoke in hushed tones about unexpected transparency. Victoria ignored all of them. She moved quickly through the corridor until she reached the quiet service hallway behind the main stage. The noise from the convention hall faded there, replaced by the low electrical hum of industrial lighting. Then she stopped walking. Ethan stood near the far wall with his hands inside his coat pockets. For a second, neither spoke. Victoria looked at him carefully, almost like she no longer trusted her own eyes. "You're here," she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. "You shouldn't be." "Probably not." She crossed her arms tightly against herself. Not defensive, holding herself together. "Why did Claire call you?" She was worried. Victoria gave a tired laugh under her breath. Everyone's always worried once you finally stop pretending. Ethan watched her silently. The makeup around her eyes remained flawless, but he could still see the damage underneath now. The exhaustion, the grief she carried like hidden weight beneath expensive fabric. Victoria looked away first. "You still haven't answered my question," she murmured. "What question?" "Why are you still here?" Ethan stepped closer slowly. Not enough to touch her, just enough that she no longer looked alone inside the hallway. "Because," he said quietly, "you finally stopped acting like you don't need anybody." Victoria's face broke before she could stop it. Not dramatically. Worse. One sharp breath, then another. Her eyes filled instantly as years of controlled composure cracked open all at once. Ethan moved without thinking and caught her gently when she leaned forward against him. Victoria buried her face against his shoulder and cried silently in the empty backstage hallway, while he held her with one rough hand against the back of her red dress. And for the first time in years, nobody asked her to be strong. By early spring, Boston no longer looked buried beneath winter. The harbor water moved again instead of sitting dark and frozen beneath gray skies. And small patches of green had begun appearing stubbornly between sidewalks and old brick buildings across the city. Victoria Hale hated spring. Not publicly, of course. Publicly, Victoria liked whatever successful people were expected to like. Fresh starts, reinvention, optimistic quarterly forecasts. But privately, spring always reminded her that the world continued moving no matter who disappeared from it. This year felt different. Not easier, just quieter inside her head. The Second Harbor Initiative officially launched in March, using mostly Victoria's personal money, though the press kept trying to frame it as a corporate expansion strategy. The program focused on restoring abandoned residential properties across South Boston and Dorchester into affordable housing for working families, older laborers, and single parents who had been priced out of the city. Victoria refused ribbon-cutting ceremonies. "No giant checks," she told the media team during one meeting. "No photographs of executives pretending they discovered compassion." Claire Bennett nearly smiled hearing that. The first renovated property sat on a narrow street near Dorchester Avenue. The house itself was small and badly neglected when purchased. Cracked pipes, unstable wiring, mold hidden behind kitchen walls. Most investors would have demolished it immediately. Ethan Brooks repaired it room by room instead. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, he stood inside the kitchen, tightening the final valve beneath the sink, while old blues music played softly from a radio near the window. The house smelled faintly of sawdust, paint, and fresh coffee. Ethan looked tired in a healthier way now, still lean, still rough around the hands, but some of the heaviness he carried during winter had eased slightly. His beard remained short and uneven in places because he still trimmed it himself with cheap clippers at home. The old scar along his forearm flashed briefly whenever he reached overhead to work. A large golden retriever lay sleeping near the kitchen doorway. His name was Murphy. 10 years old, broad-faced, white fur beginning to spread around the muzzle with age. Ethan adopted him from a shelter after the divorce, because the apartment felt too quiet otherwise. Murphy moved slowly these days due to arthritis in one back leg, but he followed Ethan everywhere anyway, with stubborn loyalty. "You planning to retire today, or supervise?" Ethan asked without looking down. Murphy thumped his tail twice against the floor. The front door opened. Victoria stepped inside, carrying 2 paper coffee cups, and immediately paused at the sight of the dog. Murphy raised his head lazily. Victoria stared at him, then at Ethan. "You have a dog?" Ethan leaned back beneath the sink slightly. "That sounded almost accusatory." "You never mentioned a dog." "You never asked." Victoria crouched carefully beside Murphy, her beige coat folding softly around her knees. It was the first time Ethan had seen her wear that color. No red. The realization caught him quietly off guard. Murphy sniffed her hand once before resting his heavy head against her wrist, like they already knew each other. "Well," Victoria murmured softly, "you're less emotionally unavailable than your owner." Ethan laughed under his breath. A real laugh this time, not restrained. Victoria looked toward him immediately after hearing it because she realized she had never heard that sound before. It changed him. made him look younger somehow, less tired around the eyes. "You should do that more often," she said. "What?" "Laugh." Ethan slid out from beneath the sink and wiped his hands with a rag. "You should probably sit down before people start thinking I've become fun." Victoria accepted the coffee he handed her and leaned lightly against the kitchen counter. Sunlight filtered weakly through old windows behind her, catching strands of dark hair resting against the collar of her coat. 3 months earlier, she would have looked out of place standing inside a half-repaired working-class house. Now she looked strangely comfortable there. Not because she belonged to Ethan's world, because she had finally stopped trying so hard to belong only to hers. "You missed a meeting this morning," Ethan said casually. Victoria took a sip of coffee. "I postponed it." Claire sounded terrified. "She survives on controlled panic." Ethan smiled faintly. That had become their rhythm lately. No dramatic confessions, no promises. Just pieces of ordinary life slowly making space for each other. Some nights, Victoria called him after difficult board meetings and said nothing for the first several minutes. Ethan never pushed conversation out of her. He simply stayed on the phone until she spoke. Other nights, Ethan stopped by her office after late maintenance inspections across Hale and Mercer properties. Victoria would remove her heels beneath the desk while he sat across from her, drinking terrible corporate coffee and describing electrical disasters inside century-old hotel walls. Neither of them used words like relationship. The truth felt quieter than that. Near the front hallway, footsteps approached across unfinished wood flooring. A woman entered, carrying folders against her chest. Diane Foster looked exhausted, in the permanent way single parents often did. 36 years old, dark skin, thin frame hidden beneath a hospital jacket 2 sizes too large because she had lost weight during the past year. Her curly black hair was tied loosely back, and deep shadows rested beneath her eyes from working overnight nursing shifts while raising 2 children alone after her husband left during her 2nd pregnancy. She stopped short seeing Victoria. "Oh God," Diane said immediately. "I didn't know. I can come back later." Victoria straightened calmly. "Please don't." Diane looked uncertain. People usually became nervous around Victoria Hale. She carried power too visibly for comfort. But Ethan stepped forward naturally. "Kitchen's finished," he told Diane. "Water pressure too." Diane looked around the small house slowly, almost disbelieving. Her fingers tightened against the folders she carried. "My kids each get their own room?" she asked quietly. Ethan nodded once. Diane pressed a hand briefly against her mouth before looking away. Victoria noticed the reaction immediately because she remembered her own mother crying over apartments once, when Victoria was young enough not to understand why. "You don't need to thank anybody," Victoria said gently. Diane gave a weak laugh. "That's easy for rich people to say." The honesty surprised everyone briefly, but Victoria did not look offended. Instead, she nodded slightly. "Fair." Diane exhaled slowly, then softer. "Sorry, I'm just tired." "I know," Victoria answered, and for the first time in years, she actually did. An hour later, after Diane left with paperwork and house keys clutched tightly in shaking hands, the house grew quiet again. Murphy snored softly near the window. Outside, harbor wind moved through narrow streets carrying the smell of thawed pavement and ocean water. Victoria stood beside the front porch railing, looking toward the fading afternoon light. Ethan joined her a moment later. For a while, neither spoke. Then Ethan glanced sideways toward her coat. "No red today." Victoria looked down briefly at the soft beige fabric around her shoulders. "No." "You running out?" A faint smile touched her mouth. "Maybe I just don't need it as much anymore." Ethan studied her carefully after that. Not the CEO, not the woman from magazine covers, just Victoria standing quietly beside him while spring wind moved through Boston streets below. And for the first time since her mother died, the sentence she had spoken felt true, even to herself. Sometimes, God doesn't change our lives through miracles that fall from the sky. Sometimes, He sends people who force us to see what we've become. This story is a reminder that success means nothing if we lose our humanity along the way. If this story touched your heart, share where you're watching from. Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, protect your family, and bring peace into your life.